So I thank you all for the blessing of today. And I almost don't know what to ask because that was so rich. It's almost like I want to say to you all, what do we do tomorrow? What do we do tomorrow? And also, what do you think you gained from what other people said here? And what is the place of radical love, which is really the essence of what June was about. You're right, not talking back to power, radical love.
Building on what Aja said, I think if we're talking about what tomorrow, to me, a huge part of what June gives me is not to believe what is aimed at me, and to look under the surface of that down to the molecular, the word the, down to that level and as big as it gets. Yeah. And just to emphasize that words are not going to make the revolution. And speaking truth to power, if power remains in the forms in which we've seen it, is also not going to change the shitstorm we're in. So to even just, if that's what we do, is say, okay, let me at least keep my eyes open while this is happening. And let me see what is actually going on and what my part of it is. To me, that was so helpful, that emphasis, what you said. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think to take seriously the idea that radical love will unmoor our assumptions as well as our training, that it'll teach us to look where we've been trained not to look. And I think in the tradition of June Jordan, that would be one toward the incarcerated, but also to the voices of children. So I think quite often actually about her essay, the voice of the children, and the stakes of that, what it means to believe that children have a culture, that they have their own ideas, and that the world's hatred for children is rooted in the idea that they remind us of our own vulnerabilities, right? So I think as teachers, part of what's important is that we always have our attention toward the most vulnerable, not just of our students, but the communities they come from, and that we take their knowledges seriously, even as we operate inside institutions that, by definition, seek to destroy those forms of knowledge, right? And to put a kind of hegemonic vision above it, to say you actually don't come from anywhere. And part of the reason you're here is to get our stamp of approval so you can enter the workforce, right? And so part of what we have to do as educators in all of these spaces, I think, is strain against that and risk our lives for the sake of another human vision that's much broader.
I just want to celebrate how 4 different interpretations of what we were asked to do today were all so different, and I think that's what we want and want to look for and expect in our lives. To hear the individual voices, to hear when other people were speaking, I kept thinking, oh, why didn't I think that? Why didn't I say that? Oh my God, that's so interesting. And I wish I could rehear what every single person said, to be able to take it in and have those moments where I think, do I believe that? Can you hear me? These aren't on, right? Okay. So to be able to take something in and through myself and say, do I believe that? Let me think about that. What was that? Am I going to forget it by tomorrow? I think that these conversations need to be happening all the time. And what I loved, too, about what Aja said is they need to be happening all over the place. I always wished that we could have a bus that would just go to, beauty parlors and, shopping malls and things like that and jump out and just have readings there. But it never quite happened.
Something that was said that I wrote down was to create a cosmos based on connection, not division. And I felt like that was really powerful because I think we are in a time where because we disagree, we think that we're divided. And so we have to find harmony again and what it means to try to create more harmonious spaces. So it's, even just thinking what you just shared, it's like the last poem that we shared in our last Poetry for the People was Kids Who Will Die, or The Kids Who Die by Langston Hughes. And it was so interesting because it's such an old poem, but in this current moment, we're right there, we're in the backyard of Broward. So it was an entry point for not just the people who were in Poetry for the People, but they used it at their next organizing meeting.
Yeah.
And then they were able to have a conversation about the labor workers, and then they were able to have a conversation about what Langston was talking about at the time. And so you realize that a poem is not just the individual personal, experience of writing it, but it's also the communal response or receiving of that. And it's in being able to be around people and discuss what a poem is doing or not doing that you really find the joy of a poem, or the sadness, depending on how deep the poem is. But that's been a really powerful thing for me, is when even talking about June Jordan, what are the different ways that everyone can enter the conversation?
Yeah.
I just want to ask one more question. Ash, I think you're the only one right now that's not teaching in the university, just right now. That doesn't mean you won't, because we poets end up in the university since about the 1940s, when they made a place for us. But they really don't have a place for us, most universities, because they think poetry is very soft and touchy-feely, or, and I get this all the time when somebody says, "What do you do?" And, I'll say at a cocktail party, "What do you do?" "Oh, I write poetry." "Oh, I used to do that when I was in high school," And I've always said I want to meet a neurosurgeon and say, "Yeah, I used to do that when I was in high school, but, I grew out of it." So in the university, there's this push and pull between, I think, for all of us, and also outside of the university, for rigor, what Donna was talking about, and not just stand up when somebody elderly gets on the bus, but sharpen your arsenal of tools, and being accompaniers to these students who have such a hard time, and particularly now as the university itself and everything gets more metric. What are the learning objectives? What are the skills what are the skills your students are learning? Can you quantify this? Everything's being, and Donna and I are particularly facing this in a public university. I don't know whether it's happening elsewhere, but I'm sure it is. Yeah. So rigor versus softness. How do we?
It's not either or. Poetry is both and it's moving from one thing to the other, and you can be rigorous and soft. And I mean, I write because it's easier for me to figure out what I'm thinking when I write. So I don't exactly know how to answer your question, but I just never think it's one thing or the other. And I think that sometimes when we think hard and soft, sometimes the hardness in my students is fear. And it's slightly different from what you're talking about, but it's stance and what they think power is. And to get them to the soft place needs the tools, those rigorous tools, to allow them. That's what Adrienne Rich meant when she had the unfortunate metaphor, because we didn't know anything then about the asbestos gloves.
Right.
The craft, it was like the asbestos gloves that allowed her to go into those scary places. I think we teach them how to use the tools and teach them that,
Right.
yeah.
I guess I was saying, how do we teach the ones that are not our students? I think we know, or we make our way through one by one, right? And in communities, but how do we fight that in our own institutions?
Or you mean administration?
Yes.
Just a thought about the institution and our place, because I'm obsessed lately with these maps of how this power is actually working. Don't ask me where I've been not paying attention to it, but here I am. So the MFA was a project of military intelligence. It was invented, the Iowa Writing Workshop was invented, you could trace it right back to Norman Pearson at Yale, who recruited James Angleton and that whole network of people. It was a plan to particularly tilt U.S. writing away from communism. It was a way to, what they call a honeypot, a way to attract, maybe we're all here, the non-communist left. as a way to put a particular set of, I mean, I guess the ideological values are obvious there, but there are aesthetic values that go with that too, that we are all drenched in, whether we are constantly aware of it or not. So one of the things I loved rereading June's work for this day was remembering the plan to build houses on top of the tenements in Harlem.
Skyrise,
Right?
Yeah.
I had forgotten about that. And there's something about June's awareness that the next thing that's beautiful comes from the ugly thing now. It can't not. We're here. We have one foot in this, and whatever's to come is going to be made part of this. So that fact of who we are in the academy, that I pay my rent because of an institution invented by the CIA, to me is an equivalent of that project. To say, okay, I'm here, could I make something else of it with my eyes open?
Yeah. And that critique of the university, I think, is embedded in June's work, right? So even if we think about Notes of a Barnard Dropout, for instance, right? Well, she talks about reading Whitehead's Aims of Education and actually rooting her critique of the college in that, you know, if the college didn't teach me any of that stuff, right? And so part of what I think that propels us toward is the idea that the university should not be our primary site of knowledge production, right? So quickly, I want to say something about rigor. I believe in rigor just because I come from people that believe in deep study, and many of them did not go to college, right? So I think a ton about not just the Panthers, right? The founders who did meet at a college, which is important, but folks like George Jackson, right? Who clearly read a ton, and he was in a prison cell, right? Malcolm X, again, another prison intellectual, Etheridge Knight. Like, these are the folks that I'm pulling from and always reading with my students to unsettle that connection that we make between a kind of bourgeois university and the idea that one reads a lot, right? Robin Kelly and Hammer and Hoe is pulling us toward this as well, right? So sharecroppers reading Marx, like this stuff is black sharecroppers reading Marx in the South, and I think we always have to, I think, unsettle a vision of rigor that would propel us toward a classroom as the model site, right? I think knowledge is being produced all over the place. It's being produced in kindergarten classrooms, it's being produced in the prison, it's being produced on the corner. Beauty salons came up, and it made me think of my grandmother who would pay me and my older sister to spell words. Right, so the first place I learned to love language was not a university, it was not a high school classroom, it was in the company of older black women that were celebrating my mind and teaching me to expand it and cultivate it through study and through care.
Shall we open up to the audience? Questions?
Yeah, so we wanted to open up the discussion to our audience. Jan, you should see.
Well, I'm just going to point. Okay. No, you point.
Sure.
This question is for Aja. You mentioned that you work at the Miami-Dade facility for inmates. And I was just wondering, I spent time living in Miami, and I also considered working in a facility. So I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts on teaching poetry to the inmates on more of an avant-garde, I guess, like perspective, rather as we're using the word rigorous. So like studying the works of renowned poets that have more of a format.
I want to make sure I understand your question. Okay, so you're
Like, are
saying,
they picking up more of an avant-garde style, or more of a, I guess, like, rigorous style of poetry? Like, which do you feel you lean more toward in your teaching?
so I want to elevate a program called Exchange for Change. They started the workshops in prison at Dade Correctional Facility, I think about 3 to 4 years ago. And there are people who have been doing it for a while here. Breon Bain is one of the brothers who has been doing work at Rikers Island for several years. But they started as the reason why it's called Exchange for Change is it was an exchange program with, I think it was FIU or University of Miami. It was an exchange program with the academy. And in that exchange, they saw that essentially you couldn't tell who was who by the end because the poems were so strong and so clear and so precise with language that at some point it was indecipherable and the only way you could is based on content maybe or slang. And what I learned in my program, the reason why I came in, I was asked to do a judge of, like, they do a poetry slam, which is one of the few events that all the inmates are able to come to and organize together. I then was asked to do a workshop, and I was like, well, I'm doing poetry for the people already in the community. This is an opportunity for the community exchange with the prison. And after our workshop, Dream Defenders started doing a workshop in the prison. So now we have community organizers in the prison who are also have on their board Angela Davis, Michelle Alexander, who wrote the new Jim Crow. We've been teaching them excerpts, which is a book that's banned in prisons. A lot of the reading that we do. So they are hungry for knowledge. It doesn't matter what it is. At the end of the day, they, you know, when you've been denied, one, your humanity, two, you know, decency, your right to care and love, any act of care is treasured. So any poem I bring in is a radical act of love and care. So some of the poems can range. Like I bring in what's the name of Tongo's book? Do you know Tongo?
Heaven is All Goodbyes?
Yeah,
That
Heaven
book
is
is
All
fantastic.
Goodbyes. They love him. We got to bring him into prison. It's one of the best books of 2017. I had my book come out in 2017. I think his book is better than mine. He's an incredible poet. I would hands down say he's the Gil Scott-Heron of our generation, if not better. And then there was also, like, I bring in Martin Espada, I bring in Etheridge Knight, I bring in Jimmy Santiago Baca. They love him. They love Jimmy. And I think part of it is what we've learned in some of the irony of it all is that they pull more out of the poems than academics do. You know, like we've had some of the like poetry's not a privilege. So for them, when they decipher meaning in something, in a metaphor or in a simile or some kind of meaning comes out of the poem, it's literally like fresh water.
Yeah.
You know, so they get so excited about it that it reignites my excitement about poetry. It makes me love poetry in a way I never knew was possible, because I'm like, wow, this is poetry. I didn't know poetry was actually doing this. You know, it's literally sending like messages. It's coding. It's like in war, like, you know how they used to do the that's what it is. It's like sending codes to people in pressing situations. So people say you go in to teach, right? Saul Williams taught me something that was really interesting. I'll end here. Was that I first asked him about an opportunity to teach in Omega. Somebody told me they asked me to teach there, and I asked him, "Oh, you've taught here, so what do you think? Like, I don't know if I should do this. It seems like a weird hippie place, and it seems almost like a cult." So I was like, "I don't know if I'm gonna go." And he's like, "No, you should teach there, but be prepared to learn more than to teach."
Yeah.
And so every time I go in to teach, that's how I come to it. You know, my pedagogy is like, I can't teach them nothing that I'm not willing to learn. So I learned so much from them, and I believe they're the professors. You know, it's just a horrible reality that we live in, where people aren't given second chances, and there's no real rehabilitation. Because many of these people there's people who've been in prison longer than I've been alive, and it's an injustice. It's slavery.
I'd like to make an observation, and I'd like to ask, have you all respond whatever your heart tells you to say, so to speak. So I was pondering about the everything that all four of you have been saying, and this might be too general, but what I think is sort of what is being said is that we write poems, or whether or not we write poems very quietly, secretly, only to ourselves in our private journals, our private confessions, so to speak. But I know, and I'm aware that poetry isn't just a little conversation, an intimate conversation with our other selves. It is, what you have all been saying is that it's action, and it's about being in a place, it's about using poetry to be establishing it as a common ground. using it to base a way of thinking, a way of perceiving, and drawing in different perspectives and making everybody who's involved participating in that realize that it's a very including, rather that it can be an including thing rather than an excluding activity. And then, so there's the action. So we write the poem and then we act. So the action can be manifested as, I'm going to go join a group of other people who are writing and thinking, and this is me acting out my feelings of being a poet and wanting to be with other poets. But behind that, my idea is change. But I don't think that I'm changing the world by writing a little poem to myself, telling myself how much Harry means so much to me, but he doesn't even look at me when I walk into the classroom. But I would think that I was changing the world if I joined a protest or march, even though I'm too young to have experienced the marches in the 60s, that the energy that was around at that time. But now, and then you were saying about hard and soft, so that they're not mutually exclusive, in other words. So maybe that's what we could say about poetry. It's not mutually exclusive. It can be climbing on the barricades and banging on the doors and beating our drums. And it can be very visible and very, not exactly aggressive, but just very assertive about what we want. Okay.
So the question is?
Oh, well, no, I just wanted your reflections on my thoughts, I guess. But, poetry can also be, like I said, it's just very private affair. So, thank you.
I hope I'm understanding what you're saying, but I think that part of what June Jordan's work does is dissolves that distinction and makes me see that it's part of this sort of psyop that we're all living in. I was thinking about, I was in a school once, an elementary school in the city, and some kid said to me, poetry's for rich people. And I thought, I knew exactly what he meant, I mean, I got taught that too in some ways. But I also felt like, what I'm calling a psyop, like these lies that we're so used to that it's in the air we breathe. They're made of words, right? So whether it's in our words in our privacy or words publicly, it's a structure that we're making all the time. The stuff about we're powerless and we can't do anything, it all happens because we put in our little bit of consent, right? Yeah. So if you can use language in your privacy, on the street, everywhere you exist, to say, I'm not buying that shit anymore. I'm not doing that. I'm not voting for that person. I'm not acquiescing to this. I'm not going to be paid to do X, Y, Z. All of that stuff. If we pull that out, all of us, it's done. It's made out of words. The guns back it up. But the structure itself is made out of words.
Yeah. And I think it's part of why we have to study. I mean, that piece of language strikes me so much, that poetry would be for rich people. I mean, I'm just thinking about sort of the history of black poetry in the United States sort of runs so clearly against that. Like Langston Hughes is packing out theaters to hear these beautiful poems, right? Audre Lorde says she writes poetry because it's short enough that you can make it between shifts, right? Lucille Clifton writes these short poems because she has 6 children, sort of in stair step, and they have to be short enough for her to memorize when one's waking up and another's going to bed, right? So this idea that poetry is the province of the wealthy, I think is a really terrifying one, in part because I would never have gotten into it if that was the case. Like, I became a poet through Poetry Slam that I was doing with other Black and Latinx kids that were poor and working class until I met Aja when I was a 17-year-old boy. So I think part of what we have to do is we really have to give historical context for the work that we're doing at all times. That poetry, especially in the United States, has never been, I think, primarily the province of the rich. I went to an all-black private school when I was a boy called the Modern School, and it was founded by a woman who's the niece of James Weldon Johnson, who wrote the Black National Anthem. The Black National Anthem is a poem, right? That's important. Imani Perry has a beautiful book called May We Forever Stand that does this incredible formless close reading of it as a poem, right? These are intricate parts of Black social life in the United States. We grow up memorizing We Real Cool and Langston Hughes' Dreams, and that belongs to those communities too, right? So this question of private and public, we also have to think about which private spaces, which publics, right? And make sure that we lift up those histories that are actively suppressed. Otherwise, we come to think about genre and form in ways that are blatantly ahistorical, and erase what's always been before us and with us, right? People are doing this work, and they've been doing this work for a long time.
June said, these poems are things that I do in the dark.
Yeah.
And as I believe the Old Poets House had that on the wall, right? And right around the corner on the wall, as you leave here, you'll see something that says, I Dwell in Possibility, written by Emily Dickinson, who, in the privacy of her own room, in the privacy of her own soul, and never really expected us to be reading them all these years later. In the last march I was on, wore words on my coat, right? The words that resist, or words that were what's now proved was once only imagined, or I dwell in possibility. We bring our bodies, which the poems are made out of our bodies. They're made out of our breathing and it's music. And when we put them inside, when somebody else says June Jordan's poems, June is in. When I read June Jordan's The Bombing of Baghdad, she's in me, right? And so something she might have written in the dark comes through my body and changes me. And again, I just want to keep saying it's not either or. It's never either or. Well, except when you're talking about Trump.
Hi, my name's Rebecca. I listened to you this summer in the park. So I know June Jordan from Outright. Outright was a gay and lesbian writers conference back in the 90s. And I've been an organizer longer than I was at Sarah Lawrence, and I'm sort of not really there anymore. But and we used poetry for the people with immigrant and refugee women and children, immigrant and refugee women of color, who first, that's how we taught English. And so I don't have a lot of trust in, even though I've earned a living at times from the academy, I know what's possible in community. And I also know how deeply, deeply damaged kids are being in the academy, right? And my soon-to-be former institution, I know what's happening to Black kids there. So I understand in the community how to teach poetry and what it means. I don't, and where the change can happen, and where the young'uns I work with and the adults I work with will take it. I'm not quite sure with the academy, so maybe you can help me with that.
Can I speak to that for a sec? So I went to Sarah Lawrence, and there, and then I also went to grad school, went to School of the Arts of Chicago, and there I met a professor by the name of Craig Harris, who transformed my entire life. He introduced a book called Methodology of the Oppressed by Chela Sandoval, which transformed me. I think she's probably one of the most quoted, not quoted academics, which means a lot of times people bite her stuff and don't give her credit for it. But it was the first time I thought of the labor of the academy as something that was worth doing. And just because, had she not written that book, I would not have had context for what I was doing in the world. And what I share with you, but also what I push for folks who are in the academy to do, is to use the institution to create more opportunities outside of the institution. Because what ends up happening is we know we live in the world we live in. We know we have the constraints we have, but we need disruption, and we need intervention, and we need people who are going to transform the function of what the academy has been used to do. So in actuality, I had a lot of scarring when I was in college and grad school. It was some of the most traumatizing times of my life. But I used that time, because a lot of times Black and brown kids aren't afforded the time to have philosophies and ideas about the world and dreams about what we could do. It was my time to wander in my thoughts. It was the only time I was afforded to do that. And so my goal is to find more ways to do that for young and Black and brown kids and poor people in this country outside of the academic institution. It's very hard because they want you to be indoctrinated. That's the whole process of the academy. You're supposed to be indoctrinated. So you think you going in there going to change something. What ends up happening is you get more change than you changing things. And so I feel your frustration. And part of, I think, my hope is that people will read someone like June Jordan and not just see the title of her degree, but see what she did with her degree with Poetry for the People. And it's failed. Actually, we failed Poetry for the People as a society, because when I went to UC Berkeley, when I talked to the students, they told me that it's just a class people take and it's not really doing much. So what makes me frustrated is that here I am trying to fight to find funding to do the work I'm doing in the community. I can't find the resources. But here there is an institution that has her name, is using her work, and they're not even in the community. So what's frustrating doesn't mean that people don't come out of there and do great things. I'm not denying the work that people are doing. What's frustrating is we have to do an in and out. We have to bring water to the people. We can't just literally sit around and sit with our books and think that we're going to change something because we wrote a bunch of essays. If nobody's reading it, it's not doing anything. If nobody's engaging with the work, it's not doing anything. So my call and action, like I said before, a solution for all of us is, where are you creating more room for poetry to be studied, shared, read, heard, challenged, worked on, et cetera, outside of the academic institution? Because we need to, the act of doing that is a revolutionary act, and people are educated through the poem, they're politicized through the poem, and then they start to have a sense of self-worth, a sense of identity, a sense of feeling, a place, and then they long towards something. So they start to demand that things change. It's no longer just these kids that are in Florida, they were doing what they did because their teachers gave them the speeches and the poems and the literature for them to be able to voice the words that they're saying. So we have to remember that it's the educators who are supposed to be really understanding their role. And if they don't understand their role, then we're failing each other.
I would like to speak to that for a second. And to get away from the word the academy for a second, because we are and can be an oasis for our students. We are an oasis for our students. And school was an oasis for me. I went to Hunter. My family couldn't have afforded to send me anyplace else. I went to Hunter. It was free. It saved my life. And then I met Audrey. And I was drifting. I was floundering. I met Audrey, and she said, come take this class with me at Hunter College. And I'd already left Hunter without a degree, two classes short of, with incompletes. And she changed me, and she gave me things to read. That was my water. Books, my family didn't have books. And that's where I found books. And that's where I found people who would listen and people who would give me things to read. I was hungry. And And our students are hungry. Jan, you know that. Our students are hungry. And that's why I'm like, just like slap them around a little bit because, come on, bring in your work. Do the work. Nobody is going to, this is Hunter College. Nobody is going to come into your classroom and say, oh, hey, I'd like to give you a book contract. Or, hey, nobody's going to come to you and say, I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to give you this grant. You have to climb and claw your way out. And so we can teach them that. And they want it. And so I really do believe in schools and in teaching, and it's also part of the community. I mean, I'm in City University, and I taught, when I was teaching at Hunter and at Columbia simultaneously, I will say that I've always much preferred Hunter, partly because the students were just more game for things. It's changing a little bit because as administrations have it, the classes are getting whiter. They're getting more middle class. These are the ones whose parents can't afford to keep them at the other schools anymore. They're coming to Hunter. And so black and brown students are being slowly pushed out. Or, the demographic is changing. But I feel like we're there, we can be a lifeline. And poetry can be a lifeline.
Yeah. I just want to add something quickly. Because I'm thinking a lot about this essay, The University and the Undercommons, by Fred Moten and Stefano Harvey, and the paraphrase, right, the only ethical relationship to the university is a criminal one. And so part of why I commit my energy to the university is because it owes people something. It owes reparations. Frankly, these spaces, these corporations, these multi-billion-dollar corporations owe something to the communities in which they take up space. And so you asked me to talk about the June Jordan Fellowship a little bit earlier. Part of why I started at Columbia was because I grew up, in Yonkers and in the Bronx, and there just weren't programs. I had to travel almost 2 hours to get to Urban Word in Chelsea, right? And my belief was, whatever Columbia was, it was a space that owed something to children in Harlem. And if I could create anything there, I wanted it to bear the name of this brilliant artist, creator that was born there, that was born in Harlem. And I knew that it had to be able to create art-making opportunities, both for kids in Harlem, but also for young people incarcerated on Rikers Island. And I hope that that's a model and a critique of the university, because I think all major research universities owe that to the communities in which they take up space. They owe programming, they owe money, they owe space, they owe time, and they need to pay it now. And so that's what I hope I can do. I want that to be the work of my life, is to take what we're owed and to do it as consistently as possible.
So we have time for a couple more questions.
My question is, how far into working with families do any of you go? Because it is great to do the kids. I look at my own family, and I look at all the ways we use language, and all the differences, and all the retorts, et cetera, et cetera. Where do the families work with this? And how do you, and how can you, and how hard is it? Because families are a tough nugget to crack. How does that work?
Do you mean our students' families?
Anybody's, anybody, poetry for the people. Does it go to families? Does it, poetry for the people, does it go to families? Does it only go to students? Does it go to special populations? Or what about these families who are doing the shifts or doing the laundry or stuck at home or whatever they're doing, and they need language? And people need and power that comes from language. And negotiating, okay, the subway, but negotiating the power structures within the families, or the power structures that maybe they agree need negotiating with, but they don't know how. And how do you change the poetic facility of people in the family? It is really important that at least in my experience, that we all reflect on our language. Yeah. And it is hard to do in the family for automatic reasons. So I'm just wondering if any of the work that you do, particularly you, Aja, How does it work? Because it's hard.
I'm trying to work on my own family, and it's a hard deal that I got, you know? So it's just, I have a struggling relationship. My mother was a freedom fighter, is the name of my book, and it deals with a lot of things, but primarily the toxic relationship I have with my mother and her use of words and abuse of words. And I think one of the poems I have is like, when I think I am not my mother's child, my mouth betrays me. You know, I carry her fuck you like a whatever, blah, blah, blah. Like, and I realize the words that she put into me. I remember when I was a child, I grew up in the church too, not because my family chose it, because I was seeking somewhere to escape my family. I was in the church. And there's these prophetic encounters we have, and I remember an elder came up to me, and the first thing she did to me was she held her hands above my ears, and she started praying over my ears, and she said, this child has heard things they should have never heard. And she started praying in tongues, and I remember I cried a cry I never cried before. And I learned the power of words and how they shaped my sense of self, my sense of identity, my sense of self-worth. And maybe that's why I work with words. Maybe that's why I've spent my life trying to deal with words. I don't think I could save my family or my mother through words, but I do believe that when my family sees me living a life with words, they're transformed by that. They see, at one point my brother would be like, I used to argue with him about changing the world and thinking I could do something about it, and he was like, hey, ain't no words gonna change the world. Like, you need money. Money's what's gonna change the world. And I remember him just shooting everything I felt down. And then little do I know, I get a text message from him about a few months ago, and he saw me on CBS or something for the Women's March. And I remember him sending me a message, and he said, I'm really proud of you. You did something I never thought you could do with words. And I feel like, what June Jordan taught me is that, like, I can only control myself. I can't control the conditions my family was raised in. I can't control everything that my family has endured, but I hope that in working with words and in healing myself, I'm healing my bloodline. I'm healing, I'm restructuring the genetic makeup of my whole being through new words and producing new words. And so sometimes I gotta say I love you even when everything in me is like, I hate you. And that does something to me. It changes me in the doing of it. For Poetry for the People, we have a lot of different people who come to the workshop. Most of them are some way, shape, or form affiliated with our organizing in the community. So whether we throw backyard boogies jam sessions, which we do in our house, and musicians from all over the city come. One of the difficulties we have with teaching right now in South Florida is mobility. So unlike New York, where people can get on a train and go from anywhere, any time of the day, we have young people who cannot drive or don't have money to get on a bus. And so we're really finding a difficulty of getting people to places to get the thing they need. So there's a real issue with all the resources being in the cities. And so I'm really trying to find ways where money needs to move. We need money to move into places where where the train can't get to. And so there's limitations we have, like we can only do so much. So we want to spend more time with family members and really deal and delve into why people are the way they are. But it has to start with one person, and hopefully that one person can be a vehicle of change in their family.
Hi, I've seen 30 years of work at Poets House, and I've seen history come through the doors and other occasions, but this is incredible. You are right in the moment and in the future. I'd like you to think, I don't expect you to give a statement now, but I would like you to think of how we at Poets House could help. We're not a university, we're not a publishing house, we're not the academy in any way. We're open, we have a library, we have space, and if you need us, would you tell us?
Margaret, can I just add something to that? I was thinking that there's a desire to continue this with all of you to keep talking to each other, to keep sharing resources, to keep sharing ideas. And I will put pad of paper here. Please write down your name and your email. I'm sorry, I'm not like social media aware, but your email.
We'll help you.
And yeah, Aja's gonna help. So and we'll try, and maybe Poets House can be a place where, to begin with, where we can meet, continue to talk, tell each other what we're doing, share ideas, share resources. So I will put that up here to start. Thanks, Margot.
So, on that note, maybe we should continue the conversation from this space to where we can offer you drinks and we can commune and be more with June. So thank you to our panelists.